The ongoing conflict between Russia, Ukraine, and NATO continues to evolve in ways that reshape the global political landscape, and the latest demand from Vladimir Putin has sparked renewed debate. The Russian president has publicly called for NATO to retreat from territories close to Russia's borders, presenting it not just as a strategic demand, but as a red line for Moscow's security doctrine. In the same breath, questions about the final redivision of Ukraine resurface, raising fears of a permanent geopolitical fracture that may define Eastern Europe for decades. To fully understand the dynamics, it's necessary to unpack the strategic, political, and military aspects in a way that blends both the technical realities of modern warfare and the broader implications for ordinary people watching history unfold. At the heart of Putin's demand is Russia's long-standing opposition to NATO expansion. Since the 1990s, Moscow has consistently viewed NATO's eastward movement as a threat to its security buffer zone, one that historically protected Russia from invasions. With the addition of countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and more recently Finland, the Russian leadership sees itself surrounded by a hostile alliance armed with advanced weaponry, intelligence networks, and missile defense systems. Putin's call for NATO's retreat is not just a symbolic statement. It is a request that touches on the deployment of military infrastructure, the positioning of troops, and the broader framework of European defense architecture. From Moscow's perspective, rolling back NATO would reduce the pressure on its Western front and give Russia a freer hand in its near abroad, particularly in Ukraine. Looking at this from a performance standpoint, NATO's strength lies in its integrated command structure, advanced surveillance systems, and interoperability of forces across member nations. Over the years, NATO has evolved into more than just a defensive bloc. It is a collective security umbrella that coordinates land, sea, air, cyber, and space domains. The alliance has consistently upgraded its readiness with rapid deployment forces, joint exercises, and forward bases across Eastern Europe. Putin's demand, if ever considered, would undermine this structure by forcing NATO to reduce its deterrence capabilities in regions like Poland and Romania, where missile defense systems currently operate. For NATO members, particularly those bordering Russia, this retreat would be perceived as a weakening of security guarantees and a concession to Russian aggression. On the other hand, the design of Russia's strategy is carefully built on leveraging both military power and political influence. The Russian military modernization over the last decade has introduced hypersonic missiles, advanced electronic warfare capabilities, and integrated air defense systems. These tools are not just for battlefield dominance, but also for projecting power and deterrence. In Ukraine, Russia has employed hybrid warfare tactics, blending conventional assaults with cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and energy leverage. This layered approach is designed to test NATO's resolve and exploit divisions among Western allies. The unique selling point of Russia's strategy is its unpredictability and willingness to escalate in unconventional ways, making it a constant challenge for NATO to prepare for every possible move. When discussing the final redivision of Ukraine, it is important to understand that this concept goes beyond the battlefield. Ukraine today is effectively split between areas under Kiev's control and territories occupied or influenced by Russia, particularly Crimea and the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. The war has already redrawn borders de facto, and the question many analysts raise is whether a permanent partition is inevitable. Such a partition could resemble the Korean Peninsula model, with a heavily militarized line dividing Ukraine into a Western-aligned state and a Russian-controlled or Russian-influenced territory. This scenario would not only cement the geopolitical split, but also force Europe and the United States to adapt to a long-term standoff that might last generations. From a technical lens, Ukraine's performance in this conflict has been noteworthy. Despite being heavily outmatched in terms of equipment at the start, Ukraine has leveraged Western-supplied weaponry, intelligence support, and innovative use of drones to stall and push back Russian advances. Systems like HIMARS rocket launchers, Patriot missile defenses, and advanced anti-tank weapons have shifted the balance in many frontline battles. Ukraine's design for survival is rooted in resilience, adaptability, and the integration of NATO standard equipment into its forces. However, this performance relies heavily on continued Western support. If NATO were to step back or reduce its footprint as Putin demands, Ukraine's ability to maintain its defense would be severely compromised. There is also the element of political design at play. NATO's cohesion is often tested by the differing priorities of its members. For example, Eastern European countries see Russian aggression as an existential threat, while some Western European nations balance their response with concerns over energy dependence and economic stability. The United States, as the backbone of NATO, has its own domestic pressures and debates about long-term involvement in foreign conflicts. Putin's demand is crafted to exploit these cracks, pushing NATO to confront its own internal divisions. The question of whether Ukraine will be redivided depends not just on battlefield outcomes, but on how united NATO and the West remain in their support for Kyiv. From a layman's perspective, what Putin is essentially asking is for NATO to give up ground and acknowledge Russia's sphere of influence. Imagine a neighborhood where one homeowner demands that the security guard protecting other houses stop patrolling near his fence, even though the neighbors want that guard there. For NATO members like Poland or the Baltic states, removing that guard feels like leaving the door open to potential intruders. For Russia, however, the guard's presence is seen as a provocation, as though the neighbors were preparing to break into its yard. This tension captures why the demand is so controversial and unlikely to be met without significant concessions or compromises. One of the unique selling points of this crisis is how it highlights the transformation of modern warfare and diplomacy. Unlike the Cold War, where lines were clearly drawn, today's struggle involves economic sanctions, cyber attacks, energy pipelines, and even global food supplies. The blockade of Ukrainian grain exports, the sabotage of pipelines, and the weaponization of natural gas all illustrate that wars today are fought not only with tanks and missiles, but also with economic and political leverage. Putin's call for NATO retreat must be understood in this broader context, where every move on the chessboard affects global markets, energy prices, and political stability far beyond Eastern Europe. Another dimension is the symbolic weight of Ukraine itself. For Russia, Ukraine is more than just a neighbor. It is historically tied to Russian identity, culture, and security. For NATO and the European Union, Ukraine represents the right of sovereign nations to choose their alliances and future. This clash of visions means that any attempt to redivide Ukraine would not simply be about land, but about principles of sovereignty, democracy, and international law. This is why NATO's retreat, as demanded by Putin, would not just be a military adjustment, but a political admission that spheres of influence still dominate global politics. Looking ahead, the outcome depends on multiple performance factors. Can NATO maintain its unity under pressure? Can Ukraine continue to innovate and resist despite immense losses? Can Russia sustain its military campaign in the face of sanctions and international isolation? Each of these questions plays into whether the final redivision of Ukraine becomes a reality. For ordinary viewers, it might seem like a distant chess game, but its ripple effects touch everything from gas prices to food availability and even the stability of other regions like the Middle East and Asia. This is why the stakes are so high in this unfolding drama. Putin's demand for NATO's retreat is not just about military bases, it is about reshaping the post-Cold War order. The question of Ukraine's redivision is not just about borders. It is about whether smaller nations can chart their own course or whether great powers still dictate the map of the world. In blending these elements together, the strategic, the technical, and the human, the picture that emerges is one of a defining moment in modern history, a moment that could set the tone for international relations for decades to come.